My name is Judy Solano. I'm the chair of Advocates for Public Education Policy. We want to welcome everybody to this webinar. Mike DeGeer, who is our vice chair of A for PEP, will be participating as the host today. And Mike, I'm going to let you go ahead and take over.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy. We're really excited to see everyone. Thank you for being here. Several of you are from outside Colorado. We're excited you're joining us today. As Judy said, I'm the vice chair for Advocates for Public Education Policy, which we call A for PEP. We're a statewide coalition of individuals and grassroots organizations that educate the public and policymakers to ensure that public schools work for all. We advocate for the following priorities: eliminating high-stakes testing as the primary factor to measure district, school, and educator success, increased funding to address the academic, social, and mental health needs of all students. By the way, there was a Colorado audit recently that showed that we're $3 to $4 billion short in funding over the past decades. We also advocate for adequate compensation, professional licensure, and improved working conditions for all educators, full transparency, oversight, and accountability of taxpayer dollars used by charter schools, education management organizations, and private foundations. And finally, the development of community schools to address the poverty and second language challenges facing our marginalized communities. We are so fortunate tonight to have Professor Derek Black with us this evening to address the topic of how dismantling public education endangers democracy. He will help us understand both the historical struggles behind providing equitable, adequate education for everyone in America, and the current challenges our educational system faces under this new presidential administration. In these uncertain times for public education, Derek Black is the right person to address these issues. Derek Black is the Ernest F. Hollings Chair in Constitutional Law at the University of South Carolina and one of the country's leading experts in education, law, and public policy. He's the author of 4 books, and his essays and other writings have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Washington Post, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. His research has also been published in numerous university law journals. A for PEP was fortunate to have Derek Black join us last year when he shared his insights from his previous book, Schoolhouse Burning. In that forum, Derek described how states have been woefully underfunding education for decades. He also highlighted how the well-financed political agenda to expand vouchers and charter schools presents a major assault on the democratic norms that public education represents. In his latest book, Dangerous Learning: The South's Long War on Black Literacy, Derek describes in vivid detail the impact that literacy played in the lives of Blacks in the southern states. He traces the historical continuities from pre-Civil War era to the racial authoritarian regime of Jim Crow against Black Americans to the present day. His account of events is both spellbinding and shocking. Derek shows how from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of Reconstruction, literacy was critical in the lives of everyone. Literacy evolved from a subversive gateway to freedom to a public program to extend citizenship and to build democratic institutions. He explains how once Reconstruction was abandoned, opposition to educating Black children depressed education throughout the South for Black and white students alike. As I read his book, I was awestruck by some of the mind-boggling parallels with our current Trump administration, which also connected to my own life growing up as a young boy in Southern Alabama in the 1950s. I urge anyone who cares about education and its role in our democracy to read Dangerous Learning. You will be mesmerized with how vividly Derek chronicles the events so thoroughly, how he describes the ways that white and Black people alike became so engaged and enraged in their different fights regarding the contentious issue of allowing Blacks to read or write. He also reveals the deep, lasting imprint these events have had on education and how this legacy is resurfacing today. I'll be posing questions for Derek to respond to, and as he speaks, please feel free to post your own questions in the Q&A section here. We will try to respond to as many as possible during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be available on our website within a few days. So without any further ado, let's dive in, Derek, and we'll start off by asking you the first major question, which is share some of the reasons why you chose to write this book.
Well, first of all, thanks, Mike and Judy, for being so gracious and having me on. And it was great to see you earlier this year in Ohio, and great to be with you here again. This book, I'll have to say, was a little bit of a passion project that I was unsure whether I should write because, when I first started on it, I was really just sort of fascinated by these secret schools that I had touched upon in Schoolhouse Burning, these secret schools that enslaved people were operating before the Civil War in the South, and I thought the Secret Schools was going to be the name of this book. Um, but I said, look, is that a book worth writing? I mean, what do secret schools have to do with today? I mean, this seems like something maybe somebody on a PhD would do or something, but I wasn't sure, right? Um, I just kept going at it and going at it, and the story just kept getting bigger and bigger in terms of, well, how did we get to the place where we're going to need secret schools, and what were the events that made people want to repress Black education? And so, but even then, even as the story getting bigger, I said, I don't know. Again, like what does the criminalization of Black literacy have to do with what's going on today? It was really when I got to the 1840s that the light bulb began to go off because, after they had criminalized Black literacy, they then went after white literacy. I mean, whites were still allowed to read, but they didn't have a choice of what they were going to read in the South. So they started banning things for whites. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, I mean, I guess so. Those are abolitionist papers. Maybe that makes sense. But after they had basically enforced silence across the whole South, they started looking for ghosts underneath rocks. They were so paranoid that they began reviewing the school books in the 1840s. And that's when the light bulbs started going off. So they were reviewing these books in the 1840s, and we're just finding enemies where they didn't exist. And the one that sort of topped it off for me was this Southern magazine that took to publishing these 3 and 4 page reviews of textbooks, which you would think wouldn't sell many newspapers, but I guess it did. It was the most popular one in the South, and it singles out this geography book and says that it needs to be removed and that it is biased because it devotes disproportionate attention to northern crops. And I just said, look, they're so paranoid they can't see straight. They're looking for boogeyman everywhere, and of course, we've seen this moment here as things escalated. And it was at that point I said, okay, I begin to see the parallels, and then I began to see a lot more after that. But it was really just something I was interested. That I came at slowly and kind of found, I guess, the gems of connection, and then it all of a sudden seemed meaningful by the end.
Well, it must have made a big impact because your story is very well written. Talk a little bit about the role that literacy and education played in Black freedom, both before and after the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, that's the part that was somewhat eye-opening to me, which is, if you read the conventional accounts, you normally see in history books this sort of 1 or 2 lines that say, Black literacy was criminalized or Black people couldn't read and write. You just figure, okay, of course it was. That's the way things always were in the South. And that kind of seems natural to us, I suppose. But the truth is that, Black literacy wasn't criminalized until the 20s and 30s. And in fact, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were Black schools operating out in the open in places like Charleston and Wilmington and Savannah, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia, that it was not unusual at all to have Black schools. So free people of color were educating themselves, but they were also educating enslaved children. Um, and there were lots of missionaries and churches that ran schools for Black kids as well. And some of those motives may have been nefarious, but they weren't all nefarious. And so the real point is, the Black community had an education community early on, but when Denmark Vesey in South Carolina really used that literacy as a way to share information, to shape new arguments, to engage in national dialogue, to motivate a local community to read the Bible differently than whites were reading the Bible. He showed that maybe this literacy is a little bit more dangerous than some folks thought. And so South Carolina cracks down on Black literacy, and it shocks the entire, the entire nation, actually, the sort of story of Denmark VC. But the southern states tend to go, well, he's an unusual guy. That's a South Carolina problem, and all slave owners think that their slaves love them, and it's just these sort of aberrational situations elsewhere. And so the rest of the South just kind of kept trucking on, like, well, we don't really have a problem here. And then David Walker, who had actually been born free in Wilmington and learned to read and write in Wilmington, he writes. He moves to Massachusetts later on and publishes what's called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And because he was from the South, and he knew people from the South, David Walker started shipping that document into the southern seaports and putting it in the hands of Black people. And when it was first discovered in Savannah, it took the legislature 3 days to ban Black literacy and to shut down the ports, right? But you've still got this sense that, like, well, probably it's only the seaports, and probably it's only David Walker. But Nat Turner's famous revolt comes about a little under a year on the heels of that document being discovered, and the South is now in a full-blown panic about the fact that Nat Turner, who himself was also quite literate and was reading and preaching the Bible, they said, look, this is out of control. This sort of literacy is a dangerous thing, and the South then basically has a region-wide ban on Black literacy. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions. Tennessee didn't formally ban it, but in any event, it's really this later point in history at which the South goes, wait a minute, literacy is a powerful tool in the hands of the oppressed, and we need to bring an end to it.
It was amazing thinking about people worried about papers coming from the North that would somehow be read by people in the South that would cause all sorts of confusion and concern and create this anxiety that happened all across the South. That was just amazing to read about that they would actually have people at the ports making sure that none of that stuff snuck in, and if it did, there were all these punishments that were given, and the laws then were created to stop this messaging about what was going on. It was just basically, we don't want you to read about what people are saying about what's going on in our,
yeah, I mean, and not just, we don't want Black people to read, we don't want white people to read it either.
Right.
In 1835. William Lloyd Garrison and a couple of other abolitionists, I think they thought they were being funny, and that, to some extent they were. They're saying, these Southerners are all bent out of shape about Black people reading and writing, and they think their honor is being accused. So they said, what we think we should do is send a bunch of our abolitionist newspapers to them. So they got the list of all the public officials in the South and just started sending copies of the newspapers to them.
yeah.
And they went crazy over that. In fact, people were coming to the post office and, what is this? And so in 1835, I think they called them men of property and standing, gentlemen of property and standing, broke into the Charleston post office, looted all of the northern newspapers, and burned them in a city square, and hung William Lloyd Garrison in effigy. And after that moment, vigilance societies formed across the entire South to ensure that these northern newspapers would no longer, cross the Mason-Dixon line. In fact, they refused to deliver the mail until the president could give them assurances that they wouldn't even be arriving in the mail. So they were pretty serious about blocking white people's access to this information, and then what they termed to be seditious documents, sort of mere possession of certain books and documents in the South was criminal.
Controlling what it is that people are going to read and learn sounds familiar even today. So talk about the ways that the laws narrowed white literacy and freedom for the white population.
Yeah, and that's the part I was talking. I mean, number one, you have this inability to access northern newspapers, right? That it becomes criminal to possess them. It becomes criminal to talk about them. There was a newspaper man, not Elijah Lovejoy, I'm forgetting his forgetting his name, but when David Walker's appeal to colored citizens of the world showed up in Savannah, and then they're rapidly moving to criminalize Black literacy. This newspaper guy, actually the capital was Milledgeville or Mid. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it's not where it is. And that was a smaller town in Atlanta. So he was a newspaper man there, and he was like, what are they so bent out of shape about? I don't understand. Like, why are they rushing to pass? So he said he went to the governor's mansion and said, can I get a copy of this thing? Because I just don't know what you guys are so bent out of shape about. And so someone in the governor's office, I guess, it said, you can have it, but you can only have it for like a day or two or something like that. And so he took it home and had it at his place for 24 or 48 hours. But because so much was going on in the State House, and he knew he had to return it, he hadn't got a chance to read it. And so he sends a letter to Boston saying, hey, David Walker, can you send me a copy of whatever this thing is that, it's got people so bent out of shape. And so David Walker sends him a copy, and it says, in the message, it says, your friend, David Walker, right? It's just sort of a salutation. And, well, without going through it all, that was the end of that newspaper man. He was indicted, he was arrested, he was thrown in jail. He got in and out. They kept putting him in. Finally, when he got out for a moment, he just knew he had to flee, and he actually left his wife and children behind, and I think he fled to Illinois. So yeah, it became quite dangerous even for white people to engage with this dangerous material, dangerous learning. And so the society just kind of closes in on itself and becomes an echo chamber over the next 30 years.
Yeah. What were they so afraid of, by the way? What were the people in the South so afraid of that, as it relates to the Blacks reading, as well as any information coming from another source about what their way of life was what was the problem? Why were they so concerned about people learning about what the abolitionists had to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually an obvious and good question that I don't know that I've thought about quite as squarely as you put it. I mean, for Black people, the answer was pretty obvious, right? Which is they didn't want them having ideas of their own, right? That's problem number one. And they didn't want them engaging with bigger ideas, right? So, there was a version of the Bible, and which is, do as your master tells you, give unto Caesar what is Caesar, all these sort of those type of passages. And, you had, white churches and enslaved people came there that would preach this message and use the Bible to reinforce slavery itself.
Mm-hmm.
But what Denmark Vesey in particular did to say, wait a minute, this story's more complicated than that. In fact, maybe Black people ought to be identifying with the Israelites who God freed from their oppressors. And there's also negative comments about slavery in the Bible as well. And so he was quite adamant. So they didn't like that. And in fact, during his planned revolt, he had told the men that when they got to the pastors, they were supposed to slaughter everyone. But before they did that, he said, "I want you to ask them, why did you not teach me this? Why did you not read? Why didn't you preach this part of the Bible?" That revolt ended up not happening for reasons we could discuss later. But so I think it was they wanted one side of the story that reinforced slavery. They also didn't want the other side of the debate in Congress being known. So what Denmark was doing was reading the debates and the pamphlet of Rufus King, a famous senator who was arguing against the extension of slavery into Missouri, the famous Compromise of 1820. And ironically enough, Mike, I actually got a letter today in the mail from the man who lived in Rufus King's manor for 30 years, and he saw me on a webinar like that, or no, he heard me on I don't know, he heard me on something, and he wrote me the letter, and he was kind of upset that I hadn't given Rufus King his due, at least in the talk that I was giving. I said, no, talk about Rufus King in there as well. Well, he was quite a progressive man, and thought there was lots of problems with slavery, and so you've got Denmark Vesey reading this stuff in the newspaper, reading these pamphlets, and telling Black people about it. And, look, the South didn't want Black people to know that there were white people sympathetic to their plight in the North, right? And so that's the answer is obvious for why they wanted to repress Black literacy. Why did they not want white people to? One of the ways I try to think about it is that I think they knew that their position was not sufficiently strong to win an open marketplace of ideas, and they were afraid of being challenged.
Yeah. Talk more about what happened with the politics and how this whole narrowing of information and the echo chamber world impacted the politics and the debate. I mean, literally, things were just shut down for a while.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had the gag rule in Congress as well during the same period. So not only do we not want Northern literature to cross the Mason-Dixon line, they didn't want petitions calling for some restrictions on slavery to be read in Congress. Congress had been, I mean, for those who don't know, you have a right to petition Congress. It's in the United States Constitution. That means you can send letters to Congress and petition them. And the traditional way of dealing with that was that the senator or congressperson from that district would say, here's a petition. They'd read the petition, right, to Congress, and then they'd just move on, right? They would ignore it. In fact, Benjamin Franklin had been sending, a petition for the abolition of slavery since late 1700s or early 1800s. And it had always been read. And sometimes the congresspersons would say, I don't agree with this, but one of my citizens, I'm obliged to read, blah, blah, blah. But, even in Congress, it's intolerable to even have these things read. And so, you can't even talk about slavery in Congress anymore. And one of the things that I think was eye-opening to me, because again, I mean, this story is not a Southern apologist story, but it is a Southern complexity story, right? Which again, we think, all slaveholders are the same, all whites are the same. In 1826, the North Carolina Manumission Society. Now, most people be surprised to know that there was even such a thing as a North Carolina Manumission Society in 1826. Probably even more surprised to know that it had 1,200 members.
What's manumission?
Manumission would be advocacy for you to free the people. That's a process by which you would free people you're enslaved. Right. And so as a group committed to having slaveholders manumit and free either during their lifetime or at the end of their lifetime, Black people. And they had 1,200 members in 1826. But this is before the repression, before the crackdown. So we go from having 1,200 then to, I think, 6 or 8 years later, only 12 people show up. And that's the last time they ever meet. So, the sort of grassroots advocacy or sort of the opposition, right, is also snuffed out. It is no longer safe to be a member of a manumission society. It's no longer safe to openly ask questions about slavery. I mean, in the 1820s or in the 1810s, like there were people that they didn't have moral objections, but someone said, look, this as an economic matter just doesn't make sense. It's not going to work. It's white labor issues as well. I mean, they were like economists that were kind of thought this was a problem, but this all becomes completely intolerable over the course of a decade or so. And so it just becomes this, cable news station, on steroids way before TV in the South, right? 24 hours a day, every corner of the face of the earth. There's only one message you are going to receive from South of Mason-Dixon.
That's a great parallel, as I was noticing several parallels during that time period to today. And I'm just going to jump into today because I know many people on this Zoom call are wondering how this time period that you chronicled so well leading up to the Civil War and Reconstruction, how does it relate to the current situation that we're in today? And I just want to say that your last chapter, which is called Our Chance to Break the Cycle, it really hits home significantly and it ties it all together. And I'm just going to jump into that, Derek, because I know we want to get into some of those potential parallels. And let me just ask this question. How does the history of the fight over Black literacy and what people read, the fight over what people are reading, relate to the current events we're experiencing today? I mean, even though the times are different, what do you see as some of the parallels that we're suffering through right now with this administration in the last several days, several months?
Yeah, so let me tie, because we've been focused so much on, or I've been so focused on sort of the criminalization. Let me sort of tie the historical thread together real quick, and then we can talk about the echoes. So
Yep.
what happens is, number one, the repression of Black literacy creates an incredible thirst for public education at the end of the Civil War. And so
Yep.
public education comes into existence partly as a reaction to the repression before. Right. And so Black people pushed public schools into existence in the South. But this sort of repressive element that was suspicious of Black freedom through education, like they don't just go away. They don't just change their mind. They are disempowered at the beginning of Reconstruction. But by the end of Reconstruction, they're back with the same old concerns, the same old issues. And so, right, that sort of criminalization of literacy becomes the sort of, well, let's just repress public education, in the mid 1870s. Let's segregate it, let's underfund it, and let's also make the underfunded education also unequal, right? And so that happens, right? And then, of course, we sort of fast forward. We have a civil rights movement that starts, not at the voting booth, but at the schoolhouse, right? Sort of freedom for Black people. The sort of second Reconstruction starts at the public schoolhouse. And of course, we have a backlash to that as well. And then we kind of flatline, right? It's sort of like, if you sort of think about, 1978 to 2020, I have to be honest, there's not, the gains that Black people experienced in K through 12 were largely experienced between 1964 and the late 70s, right? Before school desegregation fully gets shut down. And then we just kind of go, I've been there, done that. I don't know. Maybe it's testing. Maybe that'll help us. And, we sort of mess with things. There's not any serious desegregation going on. We talk about standardized tests as a way to close achievement gaps, and I'm not trying to minimize that, but it's not like a culture shock to the system. But in 2020, right, we have this sort of what many people call sort of racial reckoning, in which we go, look, there's a lot of leftover undone stuff, right, with racial inequality, and we could talk about it from healthcare to jobs to the prison system. But the place that actually probably digs down deepest on this is the public schools, right? That says, let's really commit to not just having kids sit together at school, but let's change our environment a little bit, right? Let's make our environments more inclusive. Let's make our curriculum more inclusive.
Mhm.
Let's speak to a broader population. And, rightly or wrongly, let's start talking about justice a little bit more. And so I don't think it's ironic that at that moment when the public education system, as a matter of substance, right, starts to take, I don't want to call it the third Reconstruction because that would be giving it too much credit, but to at least think about a third Reconstruction, right? Well, that's the moment in time when our public schools really are attacked viciously at the national and local level, right? And so, there's on one level, there's nothing about banning books by authors of color that looks anything like the criminalization of literacy for enslaved people. But there is this underbelly, there is this sort of cultural uneasiness with Black freedom through education or broader freedom through education, right? That sort of challenges the status quo. That if you sort of, you zoom out to that level of abstraction, it's like, wait a minute, this is the same thing. It's been happening for 200 years that we try to push our country forward through education or literacy. And when it pushes a little bit too hard, or scares people, there's a backlash to it,
Yep.
a pretty serious backlash. And so we're living in that, and we're also living in that censorship moment. And I think that's not just about racial equity or other forms of equity, right? It is this attempt, and I think the parallels here are quite stark, right? This attempt to shape a narrative that serves the interest of particular racial groups or serves the interest of particular political groups. And that is exactly what was happening in the 1840s in particular. And we're not unique, other authoritarian countries abroad are doing that, but you see us going through that. And then a final point that I'll make, lest I go on for too long, is that I think we really have to step back in this moment and go, yeah, I mean, so we've tied the line on freedom through education. We've tied the line on the backlash. We've tied the line a little bit on censorship, but there's something much bigger going on here, which is freedom of thought, right?
Yeah.
Freedom of discussion, right?
Right.
Whether it be in school or elsewhere. And as I say in the middle of the book, the South sealed the fate for war, not in 1861 when the first shots were fired in Sumter. It sealed the nation's fate for civil war in the 1830s when it determined that it was intolerable to hear things or to allow things to be spoken that they disagreed with, right? There is no way that disagreement could be resolved peacefully at that point. But that's where the South went in the 1830s. And then it just militarized, right, and ratcheted up the tension over the course of the next 3 decades. The punchline isn't that I think we're going to have another civil war, but anyway, but it's a dangerous place to be when we shut down open discourse in that way.
Well, and we're limiting free speech and other points of view, and we're having people being taken out of universities and because of their voice that they're saying about certain issues, anti-Semitism, et cetera. These are times that are very different for some people to deal with. I'm going to jump into something around Education Secretary Linda McMahon. She has recently outlined the department's criteria for providing additional money to charter schools. And some of the criteria for that money include schools that are offering classical and or patriotic education. Those are the phrases that are being used along with some other criteria. How is this emphasis that's coming from the federal government going to impact curriculum across the states? And what are we seeing across the states in terms of the reaction to this kind of messaging?
Well, it's too early to know exactly what the reaction will be, but I have a book proposal that I was shopping around early this year that was really trying to highlight how autocracy was going to come to public education, and that we needed to really wake up and take this seriously. That autocratic forces were using the education system in ways that were frightening. Unfortunately, that book proposal became dated in about 10 weeks because so much of what I was warning about was coming to be right what I thought would be 3 or 4 years out. And so one of the things I talked about in that book proposal was patriotic and classical education, in which I said, look, these are coded calls, right? Authoritarian coded calls, or maybe not even coded, right? That this sort of patriotic education was a reaction to educators trying to, teach a more inclusive education. They think inclusive education is unpatriotic, and then this other thing is patriotic. Classical education, a little bit trickier. I mean, I always try to be careful not to paint with too broad of a brush. I am a fan of many aspects of classical education. I don't think there's anything inherently problematic about it. I think some people, maybe I'm not progressive enough to go, well, that's just teaching dead old white men stories. And I'm like, but that doesn't mean they're bad stories or bad education. So I don't sort of jump to that conclusion. But with that said, if your motivation for classical education is to only share white perspectives, right? Or your motivation is to use that label, classical education, as the label under which sort of conservative ideology can be inserted, right? And other voices can be pushed out. Well, then that's problematic. And so the sort of new push for classical education, I don't think is about trying to make sure young people read long form books in their entirety and as opposed to little snippets, which is what they get in other forms of education, right? I think it's about sending out certain messages about Western superiority and things of that sort. So I'm being careful with classical education, but it seems to me the motivations of a lot of people pushing it are racially related. The patriotic education is, again, I assume we're all patriots on this call. I'm all for I'm all for patriotic education. I just don't define it the way that current administration does. The current administration defines patriotic education as being sort of the exaltation of our forefathers who had no shortcomings in their lives, notwithstanding the fact that we know that
They were
they did.
perfect, right?
Yeah, and so and that anyone who is finding flaw in them is racist, and holding up other heroes that aren't white must be racist as well. And so what we have are terms, patriotic and classical education, and on their face might sound fine, but they really are authoritarian attempts to control narratives. They are escape hatches for white communities to say that we're going to cluster in these patriotic schools and have conservative history narratives and things of this sort. And so the idea that the federal government would prioritize that type of curriculum is startling as just sort of a historical moment, that it would affirmatively side with a politicized narrative about this country that reinforces conservative elements. At the same time, the president, when he was the president last time, said, this is exactly what he wanted to happen. So in that respect, it's I actually thought it was rhetoric back then, but now it's actually, I guess, official policy.
Policies, yeah. Well, let's tie together the whole DEI issue. Let's see, Mark Updegrove, a presidential historian, the CEO of the LBJ Foundation, says that the Trump retreat from DEI is certainly the biggest rollback of civil rights since Reconstruction. Speaking of Reconstruction, what's your take on these executive orders around DEI, racial discrimination, and the like, including that all public schools affirm they are not using DEI? Talk about that, as well as the legality of these orders and what it means for the rule of law, separation of powers, and so forth. I mean, this is very different than what we've been experiencing for the last 4 years.
Yeah. I mean, so again, operating with buzzwords is the problem with the current administration. So if all they had done was roll back the new DEI programs, I mean, I'm not saying that would have been a good policy, but that wouldn't have been like the end of the world, right? What they've really done is just they've used this term DEI to label a whole swath of stuff, much of which isn't DEI, very little which is actually illegal, to assert full-scale control over what's being taught in the schools, right? Or in the universities, right? It's sort of like, we allege that you're teaching DEI and therefore we own you, right? I mean, that's kind of the approach that they are taking, right? And just so that folks, I'm not being overly dramatic here, right? It's sort of like Columbia University, right? I don't have any skin in the game of Columbia University. And they say, oh, you guys are super woke and you've got anti-Semitic problems all over the place. And I say, number one, I don't know whether they have anti-Semitism on Columbia's campus or not. And if they do have it, I don't know if it's anecdotal. I don't know if it's, widespread. I don't know if it's ongoing. These are questions that actually really matter if you think about legal enforcement, right, and what the remedy would be. And the administration didn't present factual findings. They didn't present them to Columbia, and Columbia say, oh, no, we disagree with that. They didn't present them to Columbia, and Columbia say, oh, we're not going to fix that because we think it's okay to be anti-Semitic. There's actually 5 steps that normally take about 6 months to go from 0 to 60 in terms of a Title VI investigation. All the administration did was to say, we think you've got problems with anti-Semitism, and now we own you. We want you to change all your campus security policies. We want you to either eliminate or put the Middle Eastern Studies program in receivership. We want you to change the speed. I mean, across the board, right? And look at Harvard, right? They're like, you guys do DEI. We don't know what that means, but it means that we're now going to take over your entire hiring process. We're going to take over your entire admissions process. So they're sort of using these buzzwords, which really aren't defined or meaningful, to exert full-scale control. Or, right, you mentioned earlier with the letter that went out to every state superintendent in the country and every school district in the country that said, we want you to sign this document affirming that you're not going to do DEI or illegal DEI, or however they phrased it. And I said, this is the first time in the history of the United States of America that one single person has claimed the authority to exercise unilateral power over every single school in this country. It's the first time in our history that they've ever done that. And that document wasn't asking for loyalty to Title VI. It wasn't asking loyalty to the United States Constitution. It wasn't even asking for loyalty to the United States of America. It was asking for loyalty to the administration's racial worldview, right? And so that's the stuff of 1984, Orwellian, which is, right, I will not define for you what is right or wrong. I want you to accept my authority to unilaterally define what is right or wrong. I want you to tell me in advance that you accept my authority. And if you disagree with me, I'm coming for your money tomorrow, right? I mean, that is a staggering moment in American history, if you think about it.
Yeah, it really is. And it's caused concern, fear, confusion, and apprehension and uncertainty. And yet it's still being legally, I think, challenged in many places. Where there's how many legal lawsuits right now on so many issues. We're uncertain as to how it's going to play out, but it's creating this world of unknown right now among many school districts. And it even speaks to the issue around public money to private charter schools and how that goal is now resurrecting itself. I know I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but I'm going to end with this question around the Supreme Court decision that's coming in June for St. Isidore School in Oklahoma. You were on a panel. You did a great job, by the way, representing your point of view on that issue. And I'm just curious if you want to weigh in on that issue since it's coming up. What's your best guess as to how the court is going to rule this summer regarding whether or not taxpayer money in Oklahoma should be used to support a religious charter school? And just as importantly, what do you believe the implications will be regarding their ruling for charter school laws across the country?
Yeah, so let me talk about the implications and I'll tell you what I think could happen or might happen. So I wrote this little piece recently in which I said this case, which is a sleeper case, probably very few people on this webinar have heard of St. Isidore versus Oklahoma. This case, if not handled carefully, will be the most consequential public school case decided by the Supreme Court since the era of Brown versus Board of Education. Wait a minute, he's being dramatic again. Why is that? Because this case brings up the question of what it means to be a public school.
Right.
States have always defined that term public schools themselves. You got lots of charter schools, in Colorado, you like them, you don't like them. That's not the question. The question is, does the state of Colorado control the metes and bounds of what a charter school is, who gets one, who doesn't? And the answer is it does right now, right? It can control the system. What this St. Isidore case threatens to do is strip away the state's authority to decide who gets a charter school, right? Because right now, not all 50 states have charter. All 46 states operate under the assumption that charter schools are public schools. We own them. We control them. They may be private operators, but they're ours. We can do what we want to. And it is unconstitutional for us to have, use state money and public schools to teach people to be good little Christians or good little Muslims or whatever, right? That's the working assumption of the last century, right? And what the other side is saying is that is discriminatory and you can't do that. And if the other side wins, that means that the state of Colorado will have no choice but to issue charters all over that state. I don't know what the favorite denominations are there, but the First Baptist Church of Colorado Springs, or the Presbyterian Church of Colorado Springs, or wherever, Pueblo, whatever, the Catholic, on and on and on. And now what which would then create a complete marriage of public education. Again, whether you like charters or not the issue. Complete marriage of public education with religious education. It would allow, in the Northeast, for instance, a lot of struggling Catholic schools to go, hey, actually, we got a free ride over there. They say we don't have to follow any of their rules. Right? We can keep on doing exactly what we want to do, and we can shift this entire budget to the public taxpayers. And guess what? Here in South Carolina, every little roadside Baptist church is going to say, hey, we ought to get one of those too. And they're going to have the pastor saying, you guys need to leave the public schools. They're teaching all that immoral stuff over there. You need to come to the First Baptist, charter school. And if that becomes legal, right? You guys know school finance problems in Colorado. What happens, right, when the state cannot control who gets a charter school and you have religious advocates, opening new ones and sucking out lots of money and undermining, pulling, your kids are pulling out? The answer is the public education pie, which is already too small, is going to get cut up into smaller and smaller pieces. Yeah. The only way to prevent that would be to raise taxes. And, I don't see people sort of, doing that anytime soon. So there is a huge democracy issue with religious schools being public schools. And there's a huge school finance issue as well that they're staring at. So what do I think is going to happen? I don't know. I've been a guy who's always been optimistic about this and said there's not a single thread of precedent that supports this result. And so I've said, I think the Supreme Court, I still believe that it's possible they could get things right. At the same time, my biggest fear was, and I mean, people in Colorado, I think given the number of charters you have, you know what a charter is, but most people in this country still don't really know what a charter is. And certainly Supreme Court justices don't really know. I mean, they know what private schools are. And so is it private, is it public? And it kind of looks more private. So we think, so you've just got these sort of working assumptions that worry me that the Supreme Court might get it wrong out of ignorance. So they just don't really understand what they're dealing with. And I think that's the biggest problem. Okay, I listened to those oral arguments. I've looked them over. The last 30 minutes of oral argument was terrible, and you would think the world was coming to an end. But if you go back and read the first 30 minutes, what you see is that Justice Roberts asked two very tough questions of St. Isidore and actually literally said, hey, those cases you're citing don't actually support your position. So he said that to them. But then at the end, he goes after Oklahoma as well and says, hey, aren't you just discriminating against the religion? So, he kind of went after both sides. And so, if you try to read the transcript fairly, I think it's hard to know exactly where Roberts is going to come down. If he sides with the liberals, then you have a 4-4 decision in which, it upholds the lower court, which said, you can't have religious charter schools. It does seem like Alito and Thomas definitely think it's fine. Kavanaugh, he definitely thinks it's fine as well. So, it's a tough lineup. So, we're hoping for 4-4, which is just to hold the lower court in place. But a lot of people would come on here and tell you that Derek is living in la land thinking that, 4-4 is possible. But
I really appreciate your explanation of that, because it will have significant implications for the entire country, as you said. And that's not just a dramatic statement. I mean, the reality is we have our own states, as you pointed out in your last chapter. We've got states that are doing their own thing all the time as it relates to the vouchers that have happened across the country. And it's interesting how you tied together the states that were part of the Union prior to the Civil War. 10 of those 12 passed anti-critical race theory legislation, and they were all below the Mason-Dixon line. The other thing you pointed out was among newer states, another pattern jumps out. all 7 that passed similar legislation, North Dakota, Idaho, South Dakota, Iowa, Montana, Utah, and Oklahoma, have overwhelmingly white populations. In 6 of those 7 states, the white population exceeds 85%, and the black population is 2% or less in all but 2 of those states. And they have bills that representing free speech related to gender and LGBTQ students map out similarly. I mean, what's happening in our states across the country as it relates to the laws they're passing and the restrictions they're making with public education? We're not a United States. We're definitely a divided states of America, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, definitely those numbers suggest, right, that as I said earlier, not only are the ghosts of the South still hanging around, they're actually passing laws in states to sort of control what is read and talked about, and so that's troubling. But I always try to be a fair broker, and let me say this, and hopefully nobody signs off when I say it, which is. Those other states that aren't signing legislation aren't perfect either. And one of the things I've said in some of my talks is that I think one of the mistakes that this sort of third, if I'm just going to call it a third Reconstruction for purposes of efficiency now, of sort of progressive thought is, I think we've been a little bit too self-righteous too, right? And I think we have alienated, friends and allies by our self-righteousness, and we know it all, and this is the way we're going to talk, and this is what we're going to do in school. And I was doing a law day talk in Cleveland at the Cleveland City Club a couple weeks ago, and myself and a dean were talking about the classroom and how the classroom has had progressive students have censored the classroom as well, not by law, right? But they I mean, I don't like saying it. I'm not trying to criticize my students. I mean, we're the teachers. We've taught them to be this way, right? That they are intolerant of certain conservative perspectives, right? They are intolerant of anything that they think has this sort of glimmer of bias, or they just attack the person, right? So that part of it's just cultural, but we have stopped having robust, open debates in our institutions of higher education quite often, and in our K through 12 schools. And I think that's problematic. And so I've really been fighting against that, and I think been doing something much different in my classrooms. And some people say, well, then you're just allowing the status quo to dominate, blah, 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 But I just sort of throw that in there because maybe I'm not being touchy about the South. I'm very critical of us. But I do think we all, both the left and the right, have a little bit too much self-righteousness. They're not the same levels of self-righteousness, but we could all deal with a little bit of humility and get back to some adult conversations where we're willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt.
Well, and as you titled your last chapter, our chance to break the cycle. We need to be breaking the cycle and understanding all of these issues in a way that is less one-sided, so to speak, and understanding what's going on. We've got a couple questions in the chat that the Q&A that we want to respond to. I don't know if Rob's going to come on or not. Let's see. We've got a long one here. Let me just read this to you, Derek. Oh, here's one. The vast majority of families send their children to traditional public schools. How is it that school choice advocates hold such an outsized voice in education policy? And how can that, let's see, I didn't see the rest of that. How can that be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange that they hold such an outsized role. I had a long conversation with someone from the Texas Monthly today that was writing a piece, and we were talking about rural schools and how we got to this place. The answer is that choice, or I should say vouchers. I mean, we need to separate choice. First of all, I think school choice is a good thing, to be clear, but I think controlled school choice is a good thing, right? Choice within boundaries is a good thing, right? And so we've got great magnet schools within public school districts across this country. My children went to magnet schools. I didn't get to go to one, but great
Magnet schools are part of the district. They're
part of
run
the
by
district,
the district.
right?
Yeah.
And you like charters, you don't like them, right? There is a choice element there, right? So what we're really talking about is purely private school choice, right?
Uh-huh.
And as I said there was this wonderful piece. I talked about this in Schoolhouse Burning. This woman who was studying charter schools in Chicago, and she has this wonderful line, and she said, "The real privilege is to not have to choose a school." Right?
Hmm.
She said, the real privilege is to live in a community and know that there's a good public school there and you don't have to make choices, which is to say that school choice is a burden. School choice is only something you want when the public system is not providing for you, right? So those families that live in, nice, suburban neighborhoods, live in places like I live, right? They don't have to worry about school choice. Like their schools are, although my school district is a 90% Title I school district, but it's a good school district. But it's a privilege to not have to choose schools, to understand that everyone's going to be provided for. So I said, we should call this the burden of school choice, right? And compromise choice, right? Because people who have good, solid local public schools don't want to go fishing around for something else, right? And the reason why they want it is because the state for the last 20, 30, however many years has refused to discharge its constitutional duty to provide adequate and equal public schools. If it did that, we would have no use for publicly funded school choice, right?
Yeah.
And so we've got states that are putting communities in a vice where they feel like, well, what choice do we have but to look for something else because they won't take care of our public schools, right?
Right.
They won't create, pipelines. But to come back more squarely to that question, it is our rural communities, I think, that actually still understand this issue because our rural communities still are places where there is one public high school who serves the whole community, right? Maybe one middle school and one elementary school. They have no interest in charters. They have no interest in vouchers.
Yeah.
They want their public schools to be strong, and they also understand that just one charter or just one virtual private voucher school is enough to send their public schools under in those rural communities.
Yeah.
And they are against it. They are against it just as much as you and I and many other public schools are against it. And the way that we've gotten here, back to the question, is that you're no longer allowed to be a Republican if you do not support school vouchers. Because there are rural Republicans across this country who have stood up and blocked vouchers year after year after year. And I wrote about it in Schoolhouse Burning in 2018. It was the rural Republicans in Texas that said, no, you shall not pass, right? And it was the rural Republicans this past summer who stood through 4 special sessions called by the governor who said, no, you shall not pass, right? But what happened to those brave rural Republicans standing up for their voters? They were primaried by one out-of-state billionaire and I think another in-state billionaire who said, you're not allowed to be a Republican if you're not for school choice. And that's a very strange litmus test if you think about it. Like, whatever anyone thinks about abortion, you can understand why some people might say, that's a special issue for me. That's a litmus test for my political party. Like, agree or disagree, you can understand it. Why in the world would something as relatively insignificant as private school vouchers be a litmus test for your ability to remain a Republican representative? I'll let people answer that question for themselves.
Yeah. Well said. And it is amazing because the local public school, wherever it's found in the cities, the suburbs, or the rural areas, definitely is one that, everybody supports, but they need to be funded. You said that in your Schoolhouse Burning book, that they need to be funded adequately so that people don't have to look elsewhere for other alternatives. I thought that was really well said. Yeah. Okay, we've got one other question that I'll try and read, and then we're going to pause here at the end. I have sensed a level of unexpressed hostility in my some 35 years of teaching to literature and events I've introduced in the classroom. Since the resistance or distaste to what I was presenting was just that, unexpressed, I often wondered how I could address, or even if I should address, that kind of unspoken hostility. Do you have any thoughts that might help teachers in general address that which is sensed but not expressed? I'm not sure if that's clear enough, but that was the question.
Well, first of all, let me say, I mean, Don, thank you for 35 years of teaching, and thanks that you're still at it, sounds like. And so that's something to for us all to
Excellent.
applaud. Second, my Constitutional Law Center at the University of South Carolina, we do a lot of support on teachers in matters of civics. Yours is in literature, but we've got a presentation and some research and stuff that we do on teaching controversy, right? I'd be happy to share that with you. You just look me up, Derek W. Black at USC, and I can connect you on that. But beyond that, I just talk about my personal experience, which is not it's not the exact same as what you're talking about. But I have found in my teaching, and look, I do controversy, 5 days a week in con law, but is that it is good to get those questions out there. And so what you're saying is it's implicit or it's not stated. And so I think I have to manage the classroom in a way in which the students know who I am. I don't think there's any way that they don't know what I believe outside the classroom, but I think it's crystal clear to them that I strongly defend anyone's right to speak, no matter if some might find it offensive or ignorant or whatever. And when a student asks what 90% of the other students think is a dumb question, I still take that question as seriously, or I try to take that question as seriously as any other. And so I think the first step is to get those unstated hostilities to the surface. Mm-hmm. And the only way that I know to do that is to let each and every student in that classroom know that I am the biggest defender of their right to ask. I am the biggest defender of their right to speak. And when they do that, then we get ourselves into position to try to unpack, right? What it is that they're thinking or feeling, and sort of, and sometimes, I get a little gruffer than I should, but I you sort of lose your composure at time and slip into some other hat. But I think that's key, sort of number one, and that I openly admit to missing things myself, right? And I think that's a key. It's none of us are perfect. And I think when you show your own vulnerability, and you've been at this longer than I, Don, so you probably have better advice than me. But when you show your own vulnerability in front of students, I think you invite them to show their vulnerability as well. So that's how I try to do it. But I don't know that that's the social science, guide to doing it right.
I think your answer was very helpful. I'm going to read the last question, if you will, as a comment from one of the attendees, and then we will thank you for your time and your wonderful presentation. From Rick Johnson, he says, thinking of your comments about rural schools, humorous Garrison Keillor put it this way: when you wage war on the public schools, you attack the mortar that holds the community together. You're not a conservative, you're a vandal. I thought that was very well said. Any comments on that, Derek?
Yeah, no, I like it. I need to screenshot that. Actually, let me take a picture of your question here real quick so I don't lose it. So yeah, and so you go, well, okay, all right. So then what's going on in here? Are we overrun by vandals? Is that, because these things are passing and being pushed down. And this is the conversation I was having with a reporter earlier today, is that I don't think we're overrun by vandals. I think we're overrun by people who are willing to sleepwalk next to the vandals, right? That I don't look at, I've used the word Republican Party, probably more than I should on here, but I do not think that it is the mission of the Republican Party to destroy public schools. I think there are leaders who are opportunists. I think there are lobbyists who are controlling the party. And there are a lot of other people who lack bravery or are just ignorant, or they're just sleepwalking, and they're saying, it'll be okay, right? It's not that bad. Like, who cares? And I think it's because they don't actually understand that our public schools are the mortars that hold the community together.
Yeah.
They don't actually understand what is going to happen to some of these communities. And so they're just naively going along because it's not that they want to destroy public schools. They're just thirsty for power. And right now, walking along with the destroyers of public education is the pathway to power. And so they're walking right along with them. And that's a sad commentary on, on leadership and, where we are now, but that's where we are.
And I think that's a very good point that you're ending with. Unfortunately, so many people are just sleepwalking through this process, and hopefully they will realize at some point that this is not going to work. And we need to be restoring and supporting our public schools significantly, or they will be in danger, as well as our democracy will be, as you alluded to. Derek, thank you so much. We're going to take a few minutes to talk about our next webinar, but you were so helpful in giving us some insights to these issues today. And we're going to be sending to all the attendees information about Derek and his book, which we encourage you to consider reading. It's really excellent. And we really would encourage you to follow some of the work that he's doing. He's an expert in this issue, and I really appreciate your nuanced approach to these issues, and as well as the importance of focusing on how we can save and preserve our public education system. So thank you very much on the part of all of A4PEP. Rob Rogers, one of our board members, is going to tell us about our next webinar next month, which is very exciting. We are really looking forward to it. Rob, tell us about our wonderful guest we're going to have in June.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks again, Derek, for coming and talking with us about that very important topic. I did want to take a little bit of time to provide some information about our next webinar. Catherine Stewart is going to be coming and talking with us. Everybody has probably heard me mention and recommending her book, The Power Worshippers, if you're looking for a primer about Christian nationalism. And she agreed to come and talk to us. We've got to make some changes from our normal schedule, away from our normal Wednesday evening to Sunday afternoon. So it's going to be on Sunday, June 22nd at 2 p.m. She's actually going to be over in the UK at that time. So we had to make some accommodations to work with her schedule. But we're very excited that she's going to be able to come and join us and talk to us about the impact that Christian nationalism is having on the public school system. So that is save the date. The registration information will be available soon, and save the date on Sunday, June 22nd at 2 p.m. for that.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate it, and hope you have a wonderful evening. If you have any questions, please consider joining our A4PEP mailing list, and we appreciate your being involved in every way. Thank you for what you're doing for public education, and we appreciate you. Hope you have a great evening. Thank you.